In this tutorial, I will explain how to work with the feature called User Tours in ORIM. This feature can be very useful if you want to explain to the user what your application shows on a particular screen, by guiding the user through each element on the screen and providing an explanation for each element. This is hard to explain without an example, so let me show a user tour in action. Here I have the photo album sample application that includes a tour. A tour marks a particular element on the screen with a red marker and a number. One marker is always active, and you can see the explanation of the element at the bottom of the screen. The user can navigate between markers by pressing the arrow button here. When this happens, the active marker changes so that the user can see the element on the screen and the corresponding explanation. If an element is located off the screen, ORIM will automatically scroll the screen when the marker becomes active, so that the element is visible to the user. So going through a tour, the user gets a pretty good idea what the screen consists of and how to work with the screen. The user can turn the tour off by pressing this button here, and then turn it back on if necessary. Now that we understand what tours are about, let's see what the developer has to do in ORIM to configure them. A tour consists of sections. Each section includes the unique ID of the element on the screen. This element will be marked by a marker. And it also includes an explanation of this section that will be displayed when this section becomes active. Tours can be attached to queries to guide the user through the columns and operations of the query. This is done using the tour property of the query. Tours can also be attached to forms to guide the user through the fields and operations of the form. This is done using the tour property, which is available in the miscellaneous section of the form properties. And tours can also be attached to visual perspectives to guide the user through tabs and/or content panels of a visual perspective, and/or the contents of the content panels. This is done using the tour property of a visual perspective. In each case, the same tour dialog is displayed. In this dialog, the developer adds sections to the tour. For each section, you have to provide the ID of the element being marked, the explanation, indicate where the marker will be located relative to the element, and if a tour is for a visual perspective, and the section explains a content panel that contains a form or a query, and this form or a query has its own tour, then it is possible to include this tour as a subtour of the current tour by ticking this checkbox. The only part that probably needs further explanation here is the ID of the element being marked in this section. You can assign IDs to many elements in ORIM. Cells in forms that may include attributes or other form elements. This is the property that lets you do this. Form sections. Panel operations used in forms or queries. Columns in queries. Operation with records and queries. Content panels in visual perspectives. Tabs in visual perspectives. HTML elements used in content panels, form cells, and so on. To assign an ID to HTML element, use the standard ID attribute. For example, you can assign any text to the ID of the element. The only requirement is that the ID must be unique within the tour where it is used. When you define a section of a tour, AwareIM automatically collects all IDs contained within the form, query, or visual perspective for which the tour is being defined, and presents it to the developer to choose from. As an example, let's look how the tour in the photo album sample application has been configured. The tour is defined for the author visual perspective, which is displayed when an author logs in. I have it here on my screen. If we click on the tour property, we can see that the tour consists of two sections. The first section of the tour has the ID called Album Tree. This is the ID of the first content panel. We can see this ID here. Going back to the first section of the tour, we can see that the Include Tour of the Element checkbox is ticked. This means that the section includes the tour of the query that the content panel displays. If we look at the contents of this content panel, we can see that it displays the query album for logged in author. And if we go to this query and then go to the tour property, we can see that it has its own tour. The tour of the query includes IDs of the panel operations of the query. If we look at panel operations, we can see the IDs. Let's have a look at how this is shown to the user once again. Here I will only go through the markers of the first section. The first marker provides explanation for the content panel. And markers 2 and 3 come from the tour of the query contained in this content panel, which is used as a sub-tour here. Going back to the tour of the visual perspective, we can see that the ID of the second section of the tour is called Selected Album. Note that the Include Tour of the Element checkbox is ticked. The Selected Album ID is the ID of the second content panel. We can see it here. The content panel is initially empty, but when the user selects an album, it shows the form of the album called Image Gallery. If we look at this form, we can see that it has its own tour that again goes through the panel operations of the form. So just like the previous section, the tour marks the content panel first, and then marks the panel operations of the form contained in the panel. The last thing I wanted to mention about tours is that you can make a tour conditional by specifying an applicability condition. For example, display the tour for one category of users, but not other categories.